I zipped up my thermal suit against the North Sea wind. The material hugged my body, protecting me from the November chill that cut across Neptune's crown like a blade. After 15 years working offshore platforms, I thought I'd seen everything these waters could throw at me. I was wrong. The converted oil rig had been my home base for the past 3 weeks, investigating equipment failures along the North Sea interconnector. Austin Palmer, that's me, 48 years old, senior offshore engineer, and the company's go-to guy when expensive equipment starts acting up for no apparent reason. Rebecca always jokes that I married the North Sea before I married her, and some days I wonder if she's right. When I'd left Aberdeen 3 weeks ago, she'd stood at our kitchen window watching me pack my gear bag. 16-year-old Emma was at football practice, and 14-year-old James was upstairs, supposedly doing homework, but probably gaming. Rebecca had that look, the one that said she was calculating how many days until my next rotation home. Another emergency deployment? She'd asked, though we both knew the answer. Equipment failures on the interconnector, I'd explained, checking my diving computer for the 3rd time. 5th incident in 6 months, corporate's bleeding money. She'd nodded, understanding, but not happy. After 22 years of marriage, she knew the drill. Emergency calls meant important problems, and important problems meant extended deployments. It also meant good money, enough to keep Emma in her sports programs and James stocked with the latest computer equipment. "Just promise me you'll be careful," she'd said, the same words she'd spoken before every offshore assignment since we'd met. The kids need their father home in one piece. Now, standing on Neptune's Crown's main deck, those words echoed in my mind as Helen Morrison approached with her usual no-nonsense stride. 15 years running offshore operations had made her harder than the steel beneath our feet, her gray hair pulled back in the same severe bun she'd worn every day since I'd known her. "Listen up," she said, her Scottish accent cutting through the wind. "We've got continuing problems with the interconnector cable at grid reference NK7745. Palmer, Rodriguez, Hayes, you 3 are going down to assess and repair." Casey Rodriguez adjusted his diving mask, the Mexican-American's easy grin nowhere to be seen this morning. At 35, he'd been my dive partner for 3 years, and I trusted him with my life down there. We'd worked together on everything from emergency repairs and 40-foot swells to routine maintenance in crystal-clear tropical waters. Casey had a wife, Maria, and twin boys back in Houston. Like me, he was getting to the age where every dive felt a little heavier, every risk a little more calculated. Oliver Hayes, barely 28, was checking his equipment with the methodical precision that made him our best tech, specialist despite his youth. Fresh out of university with degrees in marine engineering and computer science, he brought a level of technical sophistication to our operations that sometimes made the rest of us feel ancient. But he listened well and learned fast, qualities that mattered more than age when you were 200 meters underwater. "Visibility's poor today," Helen continued, consulting her weather tablet. "Current's running stronger than usual, so watch your oxygen levels. And Palmer?" She looked directly at me. "Corporate wants answers yesterday. This is the 5th equipment failure at these coordinates in 6 months." I nodded, thinking about the phone call from Aberdeen yesterday. The regional manager had been clear. These malfunctions were costing the company millions. Equipment that worked perfectly until it hit a specific depth, then failed catastrophically. Sonar readings that made no sense. Acoustic anomalies that shouldn't exist in mapped waters. "The insurance company's asking questions," Helen added quietly, stepping closer so the others couldn't hear. "They're talking about classifying this site as high risk. You know what that means for our contracts." I did know. High-risk classifications could kill projects overnight, sending work to competitors and leaving crews like ours scrambling for assignments. After 15 years building my reputation as the guy who could solve impossible problems, the last thing I needed was an unsolvable mystery. "Questions?" Helen asked the group. None of us spoke up. We'd all worked these waters long enough to know when something felt off, and this job had been feeling off from day one. The equipment reports were inconsistent. Temperature readings fluctuated wildly. Even the fish seemed scarce around the affected coordinates. We descended below deck to the equipment room, our boots clanging on metal stairs worn smooth by decades of foot traffic. The familiar routine of a pre-dive check helped settle my nerves. Regulator, primary, and backup air supplies, diving computer, tools for the cable repair. In this business, equipment failure meant death, and after 15 years, I wasn't about to get careless now. Casey was methodical as always, checking every connection twice. "You hear about that maintenance crew from Statoil?" he asked, testing his depth gauge with practiced movements. "Found their tools arranged in a perfect circle on the seabed yesterday. Whole crew swears they left them in the toolbox." Oliver looked up from his careful equipment inspection, his young face creased with skepticism. "Probably just current drift. Tools get moved around down there all the time." "Current doesn't arrange things in geometric patterns," Casey countered, his voice taking on the edge it got when someone questioned his experience. "My buddy Lars on the Njord platform says they've been getting weird acoustic readings for weeks, sounds that don't match any known marine life." I'd heard similar. Stories from other crews, whispered conversations in Aberdeen pubs, worried phone calls from platform managers, official reports that somehow never made it into corporate databases. After 15 years offshore, I'd learned to distinguish between sailors' tales and genuine anomalies. These stories had the ring of truth. Dr. Andrea Foster appeared in the doorway, her equipment bag slung over her shoulder. The marine biologist had been with us for 2 weeks, documenting environmental impact for the cable expansion project. Auburn hair pulled back in a practical ponytail, she moved with the efficiency of someone used to working in difficult conditions. At 34, she was one of the few Americans working North Sea operations, having transferred from Gulf of Mexico projects after completing her doctorate in marine ecosystem dynamics. "Morning, boys," she said, her American accent still sounding foreign after weeks among the Scottish and Norwegian crews. "Let me check your comms before you go killing yourselves." She connected our headsets to her diagnostic tablet, fingers flying across the screen with the confidence of someone who debugged equipment in conditions ranging from Arctic ice flows to tropical storm systems. Andrea never asked permission when it came to safety protocols, a trait I respected in someone half my age. She'd earned her position through competence, not politics, and it showed in every interaction. "Palmer, your primary channel has some interference," she said, making adjustments without waiting for my response. "Switching you to backup. Rodriguez, your signal strength is marginal. I'm boosting your transmitter power by 15%. Oliver pointed to a pressure reading on his tablet, his engineering background making him naturally curious about data anomalies. "Water temperatures dropped 4 degrees since yesterday. That's unusual for this time of year, especially at depth." I pulled on my thermal gloves, thinking about the pattern emerging from our reports. Equipment failures, temperature anomalies, strange acoustic readings, all centered around the same coordinates where billion-dollar infrastructure projects were expanding into deeper waters. The North Sea had been mapped and surveyed for decades, first for oil exploration, then for wind farms, and now for interconnector cables. Finding genuine unknowns in these waters should have been impossible. "Platform's ready," called Lars Peterson from the launch bay doorway. The Norwegian had reinforced the cable winch system after our equipment issues last week, installing redundant backup systems that should have made failure impossible. His stocky frame filled the doorway as he gestured toward the dive platform, with hands scarred by 20 years of offshore mechanical work. Lars had been working North Sea platforms since before I'd gotten my commercial diving certification. He'd survived platform fires, helicopter crashes, and storms that would make landlubbers weep. If Lars was concerned enough to reinforce equipment that had worked flawlessly for years, then whatever was happening down there was serious enough to worry someone who'd seen everything these waters could offer. Once Andrea cleared our communications, we finished suiting up. The diving gear felt heavier each year, not just the physical weight, but the accumulated knowledge of what could go wrong at crushing depths. Casey helped me secure my helmet, checking the seal integrity with the practiced eye of someone who'd performed this ritual hundreds of times. I did the same for him, our movements choreographed by years of partnership. Oliver managed his own equipment with practiced efficiency, though I noticed he double-checked everything twice. Smart kid. Overconfidence killed more divers than equipment failure. "Comms check," I said, my voice echoing slightly in the helmet's confined space. "Reading you clear," Casey confirmed, his voice carrying the slight tension that always preceded deep water work. "All systems green," Oliver added, his younger voice steadier than I'd expected. We made our way to the launch platform where Lars waited with his final checks. The platform would lower us the first 50 meters before we'd swim the rest of the way to the cable. It was an efficient system, conserving our energy and air for the actual work, rather than burning it on a long descent. "Current's pushing southeast at 0.7 knots, Lars said, handing each of us a specialized tool belt loaded with cable repair equipment. Compensate accordingly. Bottom temperatures holding steady at 4.2 degrees Celsius. Andrea's voice crackled through our headsets from the control room, where she'd be monitoring our vital signs and communications throughout the dive. Control to dive team. You are cleared for descent. Maintain regular communication and stick to protocol. The protocol was simple enough. Report depth every 50 meters. Maintain visual contact when possible. Abort immediately if anyone experienced equipment problems or physiological issues. After 15 years, it was second nature. Copy that, I responded, beginning descent. The platform jolted slightly as it began lowering us into the North Sea. I felt the familiar tightening in my chest that came before every deep dive. Not fear exactly, but healthy respect for what we were about to do. The gray-green water rose around us as the platform submerged, the world above disappearing into memory and leaving us suspended between surface and seafloor. At 50 meters, I signaled and we pushed off, swimming downward toward the cable route. The water darkened as we descended, our lights cutting narrow cones through the murk. Visibility was poor, as Helen had warned, maybe 8 meters at best, with particulate matter drifting through our beams like underwater snow. Depth 100 meters, I reported, checking my diving computer's digital display. Visibility 8 meters, proceeding as planned. The pressure increased steadily as we moved deeper, letting our weighted belts do most of the work while we used minimal energy maintaining position. My diving computer showed the familiar numbers: depth, time, air consumption, decompression requirements, but something felt different about this dive. Maybe it was the stories Casey had mentioned, or the equipment anomalies we'd been investigating. Maybe it was just the accumulated weight of too many years spent breathing compressed air in places humans weren't meant to survive. 150, Casey called out, his voice carrying clearly through the communication system. Cable should be visible on heading 045 in approximately 30 meters. I adjusted course slightly, checking my wrist computer to confirm our position. The blue-black water surrounded us now, our lights the only break in the crushing darkness. At this depth, the sun was just a memory, and the weight of the ocean pressed against our suits with relentless force. My pressure gauge showed normal readings, but I could feel the environment's hostility in every breath. At 180 meters, I heard it. A strange warbling sound cut through our breathing and equipment noise. It rose and fell in pitch, almost like a distorted human voice calling from the depths. The sound seemed to come from everywhere, and nowhere at once, reverberating through the water in ways that defied my understanding of underwater acoustics. What the hell was that? Casey's voice came through my headset, tense and alert. In 3 years of diving together, I'd never heard him sound genuinely unsettled. The sound came again, a twisted cry that seemed to circle around us in the water. It was unlike anything in my 15 years of diving experience. Not the click and whistle patterns of dolphins, not the deep groans of whales, not the mechanical noises of submarine traffic. This was something else entirely. Control, I called, trying to keep my voice steady. Are you picking up any acoustic anomalies? Andrea's voice crackled back through static that hadn't been there moments before. Negative, Palmer. All sensors show normal ambient noise. What are you hearing? Some kind of vocalization moving around us in the water. I swept my light in a wide arc, searching for the source. Large and complex, definitely biological. I hear it too, Casey confirmed, his own light joining mine and scanning the darkness. Never heard anything like it before? Oliver's breathing had quickened slightly through the comm system, the telltale sign of someone fighting the urge to panic. Could be whale song distorted by the thermocline, he suggested, though his voice lacked conviction. Not like any whale I've ever heard, I said, thinking of the hundreds of marine encounters I'd experienced over the years. Control, can you run a wider acoustic sweep? Running it now, Andrea replied. After a moment that felt like hours. Nothing unusual on any frequency, Palmer. Our instruments aren't picking up whatever you're hearing. That was impossible. Our acoustic monitoring equipment was state-of-the-art, capable of detecting everything from submarine sonar pings to the heartbeats of large fish. If 3 experienced divers were hearing something this distinctive, the sensors should have caught it immediately. The sound faded, leaving only the hum of our equipment and the soft rush of water around our suits. I exchanged glances with Casey through our faceplates, seeing my own confusion reflected in his eyes. In 15 years, I'd never experienced equipment this sophisticated failing to detect something so clearly audible. Continuing descent, I decided, though every instinct told me to surface immediately and report the anomaly. Keep alert for any other irregularities. We pushed deeper, the pressure increasing with every meter. My depth gauge showed 200 meters when the damaged cable came into view, a thick black snake stretching across the seabed like some technological umbilical cord connecting distant continents. Visual on target, I reported, approaching the damage site with Casey and Oliver flanking me. Moving to assess. We swam closer, our lights illuminating the tear in the heavy-duty casing. I frowned behind my mask, studying the damage pattern with the eye of someone who'd investigated hundreds of cable failures. This looked wrong, not like normal wear, abrasion from underwater currents, or damage from trawling nets. Casey, what does that look like to you? I asked, as we hovered above the cable, our lights focused on the jagged edges. Casey moved closer, his beam playing across the damaged section. That's odd. Almost looks like bite marks, Oliver finished, his voice barely above a whisper. Big ones. He was right. The pattern formed a curved line of punctures and tears, as if something with massive jaws had clamped down and ripped through the reinforced exterior. Each puncture was roughly cylindrical, suggesting teeth or fangs rather than mechanical damage. The tears showed the characteristic ragged edges of biological attack rather than the clean cuts of human tools. In 15 years of cable maintenance, I'd seen damage from ship anchors, fishing gear, seismic activity, and corrosion. I'd never seen anything that looked like predation on infrastructure. What kind of marine life could do this? Oliver asked, his voice hushed, despite our private channel. I studied the bite pattern, trying to match it against my knowledge of North Sea fauna. The largest predators in these waters were seals and the occasional orca, neither of which had jaws capable of this kind of damage. Even the biggest sharks found in the North Sea couldn't generate bite forces sufficient to penetrate military-grade cable sheathing. Nothing in these waters, I answered honestly. Not according to any marine biology I know. Control, I continued, keying my transmitter. We've located the damage, beginning assessment and repair procedure. Copy that, Andrea's voice came back, clearer now. Document everything for the insurance investigation. We anchored our portable workstation to the seabed with practiced efficiency, the weighted frame settling into the soft sediment with a small cloud of disturbed particles. The work required complete focus, despite the cold and pressure, but my mind kept wandering to those bite marks and the impossible sounds we'd heard. 20 minutes into the repair, I noticed movement in my peripheral vision. A large dark shape glided just beyond our lights, moving with the fluid grace of something perfectly adapted to its environment. I turned quickly, trying to catch it in my beam, and for a split second, thought I saw a humanoid figure hovering about 20 meters away. The figure was tall, maybe 8 feet, with oddly elongated proportions that suggested adaptation to crushing depths. Its movements through the water were too graceful, too controlled for something with conventional anatomy. Then it vanished into the darkness so quickly I couldn't be sure I'd seen anything at all. Did you see that? I asked, pointing my light toward where the figure had been. See what? Casey asked, looking up from his work on the cable splice. Oliver swung his light in the same direction, the beam cutting through empty water. I don't see anything. I kept staring into the blackness, remembering stories from other crews about strange encounters in deep water. After 15 years offshore, you learn to distinguish between fatigue-induced hallucinations, equipment malfunctions, and something genuinely unexplained. The nitrogen narcosis that could affect divers at depth typically didn't manifest until much greater depths than we were working. Thought I saw someone, a person, but bigger, wrong proportions. A person at this depth? Oliver's skepticism was clear in his voice. That's impossible without protective equipment. Casey's light joined mine, sweeping methodically through the water around us. Nothing there now, maybe a big fish. Tuna can get pretty large. Yeah, I said, not believing it for a moment. Maybe, but I knew the difference between marine life and something else. This had moved with intelligence, with purpose, and the proportions were wrong for any fish I'd ever encountered. We finished the repair in relative silence, though I kept glancing over my shoulder into the darkness beyond our lights. The cable splice went smoothly. We'd done this kind of work hundreds of times before, and our hands moved with practiced efficiency despite the bulky gloves and crushing pressure. The warbling sound never returned, and I saw no more unexplained shapes moving in the darkness. But as we prepared to ascend, I couldn't shake the feeling we were being observed from somewhere just beyond our visual range. "Repair completed," I reported to Surface Control. "Cable integrity restored. Beginning ascent." "Copy that," Andrea's voice came back clearly. "Surface in 30 minutes. Decompression stop at 50 meters for 15 minutes. The ascent was routine, following standard decompression protocols to prevent nitrogen bubbles from forming in our bloodstream. At 50 meters, we hung suspended like astronauts in an alien void, our lights creating small spheres of visibility in the vast darkness. "That was weird down there," Oliver said during our decompression stop, his voice subdued. "Equipment malfunction," Casey suggested, though he didn't sound convinced. "Acoustic interference from surface traffic, maybe visual distortion from pressure effects." I said nothing but made mental notes of everything we'd experienced. The timing, the coordinates, the specific characteristics of both the sounds and the visual contact. After 15 years in this business, I'd learned to document anomalies, even when I couldn't explain them. Back on Neptune's crown, word of our experience spread quickly through the crew. By evening, an impromptu gathering had formed in the common area as people sought information about what we'd encountered. The offshore community was tight-knit, and unusual incidents were discussed and analyzed until everyone understood the implications. "So, all three of you heard it?" Dr. Foster asked, her notebook open in front of her. She'd been asking detailed questions since we surfaced, her scientific curiosity clearly aroused by our reports. "All three," Casey confirmed, settling into a chair with his coffee. "Clear as day and moving like nothing I've heard before." "Could you describe the acoustic signature in more detail?" Andrea pressed, her pen poised over her notebook. "Frequency range, duration, any harmonic patterns that might suggest a biological origin?" "It stayed too far out in the interference range to analyze properly," I said, thinking back to those moments in the crushing darkness. "But it wasn't random. There was almost a purposeful quality to it, like communication rather than just vocalization." Helen Morrison stood with arms crossed, looking skeptical in the way that 15 years of platform management had taught her. "Or, it wasn't biological at all. Military technology has come a long way. Russians, Norwegians, they've got underwater drones that can mimic marine life." "This wasn't a drone," Casey said firmly, his voice carrying the authority of someone who'd worked with every type of underwater equipment currently deployed. "Unless they've got drones that don't show up on sonar and can produce acoustic signatures our equipment can't detect." "Maybe that's exactly what they have," Helen countered. "Perfect for monitoring underwater infrastructure. Intelligence agencies spend billions on technology we don't even know exists." Andrea rolled her eyes, her scientific training making her impatient with conspiracy theories. "Not everything is espionage, Helen. The North Sea is full of undocumented species migrations. We've barely scratched the surface of deep water biodiversity." "Something that loud would have been cataloged before," Helen argued. "Marine biologists have been studying these waters for decades." "Not necessarily," Andrea said, warming to the topic. "Deep water acoustics are poorly understood, and climate change is forcing species into new territories. Water temperature changes can alter migration patterns that have been stable for centuries." The debate continued through dinner, the crew splitting into familiar camps. Those who believed we'd encountered some unknown species, those convinced it was foreign technology, and those who thought we were mistaken or exaggerating. I'd seen this pattern before on platforms where unexplained incidents occurred, rational people trying to make sense of experiences that didn't fit their understanding of how the world worked. I stayed quiet through most of it, thinking about that massive bite pattern on the cable and the humanoid figure I'd glimpsed in the darkness. Whatever was down there, it was intelligent enough to avoid our sensors while making its presence known. That suggested a level of sophistication that made me uncomfortable. After dinner, I retreated to my quarters to call home. The satellite connection took several tries to establish, crackling with static that reminded me uncomfortably of the communication problems we'd experienced during the dive. When Rebecca's voice finally came through clearly, it felt like a lifeline to normalcy. "How's my North Sea hermit?" she asked, the familiar warmth in her voice cutting through my unease about the day's events. "Missing dry land and your cooking," I said, settling into the chair beside my bunk. The small space felt cramped after the vast darkness of the deep ocean. but it was reassuringly solid and familiar. "How are things at home?" "Same as always. Emma's got a football match Saturday against Edinburgh, and she's convinced they're going to scout her for the national team." Rebecca's laugh carried across the static-filled connection. "James is still working on that robotics project for school. He's got servos and circuit boards scattered across the dining room table." I smiled, picturing our son hunched over his latest creation. At 14, James had inherited my mechanical aptitude, but applied it to electronics and programming rather than heavy machinery. Emma, 2 years older, had Rebecca's determination and competitive spirit channeled into athletics. "You sound tired, Austin," Rebecca said after a pause. "Everything all right out there?" I considered telling her about the day's events, but what would I say? That I'd heard impossible sounds and seen shapes that couldn't exist at crushing depth? Rebecca worried enough about my offshore assignments without adding stories about mysterious encounters that I couldn't explain myself. "Just the usual equipment problems," I said instead, hating the necessary deception. "Nothing I can't handle." "You've been saying that for 15 years, she said gently, her voice carrying the weight of 2 decades of marriage. "Maybe it's time to consider that shore-based position Aberdeen offered." The offer had been sitting on my desk for 3 months. Senior engineering consultant, based in Aberdeen with occasional travel to platform sites. Better money, regular hours, home every night. Everything a 48-year-old husband and father should want. "The kids are getting older," Rebecca continued. "Emma's applying to universities next year, and James needs his father around more than just between deployments. You've built your reputation, Austin. You don't have to keep proving yourself in the deep water." She was right, of course. I'd established myself as the best troubleshooter in North Sea operations, the guy companies called when million-dollar problems needed solving. But something kept pulling me back to these waters, especially now when so many questions remained unanswered. "Soon," I promised, knowing I wasn't ready to leave the North Sea behind. Not yet. "Just want to finish this assignment properly." "Promise me you'll think about it seriously," she said. "I had coffee with Maria Rodriguez yesterday. She says Casey's starting to talk about shore assignments too. Says the work's getting harder every year." Maria was Casey's wife, and the 2 women had become friends through the shared experience of being married to deepwater specialists. They understood the unique stresses of our profession better than most people could imagine. "I will," I said, meaning it. "Give my love to the kids. Tell James I want to see that robot when I get home. I will. Love you. Be careful down there." After hanging up, I sat in the small cabin, thinking about Rebecca's words. The work was getting harder, not just physically, but psychologically. The ocean was revealing mysteries that challenged everything I thought I knew about marine environments. Questions that went far beyond equipment failures and acoustic anomalies. I pulled out my dive log and began documenting everything from the day's operation. The precise coordinates, water temperature readings, current conditions, equipment performance, and most importantly, the unexplained phenomena we'd encountered. In my 15 years offshore, I'd learned that accurate documentation often became crucial weeks or months later, when patterns emerged from seemingly random incidents. The warbling sounds had been real. 3 experienced divers couldn't have shared the same hallucination. The bite marks on the cable were physical evidence of something our marine biology textbooks didn't account for. And the humanoid figure, however briefly glimpsed, had moved with intelligence and purpose. I made detailed sketches of the cable damage, noting the spacing and depth of what appeared to be teeth marks. If this was biological predation, we were dealing with something significantly larger than any known North Sea marine life. The implications were troubling from both operational and scientific perspectives. 3 days later, we returned to check our repairs. The weather had worsened overnight, gray skies matching the choppy seas that made descent more challenging than usual. The platform rode the swells with the steady motion of a structure designed to withstand North Sea storms, but the movement was enough to complicate our equipment preparations. Helen Morrison's morning briefing was more detailed than usual, reflecting corporate pressure to understand what was affecting their infrastructure investments. "Aberdeen called again this morning," she said, her expression more serious than usual. "The insurance investigators want detailed documentation of every anomaly. They're starting to ask whether this site should be classified as high risk." That was corporate speak for a potential project cancellation. High-risk classifications could kill infrastructure projects overnight, sending billions in investment to safer locations and leaving specialized crews like ours without work. "What kind of timeline are we looking at?" I asked, checking my equipment one final time. "Depends on what we find today," Helen replied grimly. "Clean repair, normal operations, we're probably fine. More anomalies, more unexplained equipment failures." She didn't need to finish the sentence. As we passed the 150-meter mark during our descent, the familiar warbling sound began again. This time, it was louder, more complex, almost like multiple voices calling in harmony from the depths below us. "Control, we're picking up that acoustic anomaly again," I reported, my voice steadier than I felt. "Much stronger signal than before." Andrea's voice came back immediately through our headsets. "Negative on our sensors, Palmer. All readings show normal ambient noise levels." "That's impossible," Oliver said, his young voice tight with confusion. "It's loud enough to feel through the water." The sound was indeed stronger, creating vibrations I could feel through my diving suit. Whatever was producing these vocalizations was much closer than during our previous encounter. I looked around, sweeping my light through the murk surrounding us. Then I saw it, a massive dark shape breaking the surface of the seabed about 50 meters away. It rose like a building emerging from the earth, water streaming from its sides in cascading sheets, before slowly settling back down into what I now realized was a perfectly concealed resting position. "Contact," I called out, struggling to keep my voice professional. "Large object surfacing, bearing 270. Estimate size, Jesus, at least 30 meters long." Casey and Oliver turned their lights toward my target coordinates. For a moment, our three beams illuminated something impossible, a structure rising from the seafloor that looked both organic and artificial. Curved surfaces that reflected our lights in ways that suggested polished metal or bone, geometric patterns that spoke of intelligence behind their creation. "Control," I said, my training taking over despite the impossibility of what we were seeing. "We have visual on an extremely large structure, artificial construction on the seabed. Request immediate backup and documentation." Static answered me. The clear communications we'd enjoyed moments earlier dissolved into electronic noise that made meaningful contact impossible. "Control, do you copy?" I tried again, adjusting my radio frequency. Nothing but electronic silence filled our headsets. The structure began to glow with a faint bioluminescence, pulsing in rhythm with the acoustic signals we'd been hearing. As we watched, paralyzed by the impossibility of what we were seeing, smaller shapes began moving around it. Dark forms that swam with purpose rather than the random motion of fish or marine mammals. "We need to surface," Oliver said, his voice tight with fear that I completely understood. "Right now." But I couldn't move. In 15 years of deep water operations, I'd never encountered anything that challenged my understanding of what was possible in these mapped and surveyed waters. The North Sea was supposed to hold no surprises. Every square kilometer had been sonar mapped for oil exploration, wind farm development, and cable routing. One of the smaller shapes detached itself from the structure and began moving toward us with fluid grace that defied conventional marine biology. As it came into our light range, I could see it was humanoid, but fundamentally wrong. Too tall, limbs too long, moving through the crushing pressure as if it were air. "Palmer," Oliver whispered, his voice barely audible through the communication system. "That's not natural." The figure stopped about 10 meters away, just at the edge of our combined lights. I could see enough detail to know it wasn't human, despite the basic bipedal structure. The proportions were off, the movements too fluid for something with conventional anatomy. Its skin appeared to have a translucent quality, revealing internal structures that pulsed with the same bioluminescence as the larger structure behind it. Then it raised one elongated arm and pointed directly at me, not at the group, not at our equipment, but specifically at me. The gesture was unmistakably deliberate, unmistakably intelligent. "Palmer," a voice said through my comm system. Not Andrea or any of the crew. A voice like water moving through deep chambers, carrying harmonics that shouldn't exist in human speech. "Austin Palmer." I stared at the figure, my heart hammering against my ribs hard enough to affect my breathing rhythm. "How do you know my name?" "We have been watching, learning. Your kind threatens our home." Casey and Oliver had gone completely silent, their breathing the only sound in my headset. I could see them in my peripheral vision, frozen in the water beside, me like statues suspended in an alien medium. "What do you want?" I managed to ask, my voice barely steady. "Understanding, your oceans grow warm, poison spreads in currents, ancient places die." The voice carried sadness deeper than the waters around us, a melancholy that seemed to echo from geological timescales. "We need messenger." Images flooded my mind without warning, bypassing my conscious thoughts and embedding themselves directly into my awareness. Vast underwater cities stretching across ocean floors I'd never seen, architecture that flowed like living coral, but showed the precision of advanced engineering. Beings that had evolved alongside Earth's waters for millions of years, watching as the surface world changed their environment faster than they could adapt. I saw thermal maps showing ocean temperature changes accelerating beyond natural cycles, chemical compositions shifting as industrial runoff and atmospheric carbon altered the fundamental chemistry of seawater. Migration patterns of marine life disrupted, breeding grounds acidifying, entire ecosystems collapsing from changes happening too quickly for evolutionary adaptation. "Choose," the voice said, its harmonics creating vibrations I could feel through my bones. "Join us below, or carry our words above." The figure extended its hand toward me, and I understood with crystal clarity what was being offered. This was the choice that had been presented to others before me. I could see their faces in the shared knowledge. Humans who had encountered these beings over decades, perhaps centuries. Some had chosen to stay, accepting physical transformation that would allow them to survive in crushing depths. Others had returned to the surface as messengers, carrying warnings about humanity's impact on ocean ecosystems. I thought of Rebecca, of Emma and James, of the life I'd built above these waters. 22 years of marriage, 16 years of watching my children grow, 15 years establishing myself as one of the North Sea's most trusted engineers. Everything that made me who I was existed in the world above. "I'll carry your words," I said, the decision feeling both inevitable and terrifying. The figure nodded once, a gesture so human it was disturbing coming from something clearly not human. Then it began to glow with the same bioluminescence as the structure behind it, the light surrounding me and passing through my diving suit as if the advanced materials were nothing more than water. Knowledge flowed into my mind, not forced or violent, but offered like a gift from beings who understood the crushing weight of environmental responsibility. Information about ocean currents, chemical changes, temperature shifts, and the delicate ecosystem balance that sustained both our civilizations. Data that would take human science years to discover, given freely in the desperate hope that understanding might bridge the gap between worlds. I learned about deep water thermal vents that served as population centers for their civilization, about breeding grounds for species humans had never cataloged, about the intricate chemical processes that maintained ocean chemistry within livable parameters. I saw how industrial runoff created dead zones that expanded like cancer through their territories, how plastic pollution formed continent-sized gyres that poisoned filter-feeding organisms essential to their food chain. Most disturbing were the projections, computer models that would have taken human scientists decades to develop, showing the cascade effects of current environmental trends. Ocean acidification reaching critical levels within 50 years, thermal expansion causing sea level rises that would devastate coastal civilizations, the collapse of marine food webs that sustained billions of humans. When the light faded, the figure was gone. The massive structure had vanished as completely as if it had never existed. Only the three of us remained suspended in the dark water, our equipment functioning normally again, our lights cutting through emptiness where moments before we had witnessed the impossible. "Control to dive team," Andrea's voice crackled through our headsets, clear and strong. "We lost your signal for approximately 30 minutes. Please report your status." 30 minutes. It had felt like hours of communication, like a lifetime of shared knowledge and understanding. I checked my diving computer, confirming that we had indeed been out of contact for half an hour, while experiencing what felt like an extended conversation with beings from another world. "All secure," I managed, my voice sounding strange in my own ears. "Repair inspection completed, returning to surface." As we began our ascent, following standard decompression protocols, Casey and Oliver remained unusually quiet. Finally, Casey spoke, his voice subdued. "What the hell just happened down there?" "I'm not sure," I said, though the new knowledge burning in my mind suggested otherwise. The information they had shared was too detailed, too specific to dismiss as hallucination or equipment malfunction. Equipment problems, maybe, nitrogen narcosis. But I knew better. In my dive log, the waterproof notebook I kept in my suit pocket, pages had filled themselves with precise coordinates, technical specifications, and environmental data I couldn't possibly have known. Chemical formulas for ocean acidification reactions, temperature gradients for thermohaline circulation patterns, migration coordinates for species that existed in no human database. The same way other chosen messengers had found their journals mysteriously completed with information that proved accurate when tested against reality. I wasn't the first surface dweller to be selected for this responsibility, and I suspected I wouldn't be the last if humanity couldn't change its relationship with the oceans that covered most of our planet. 3 months later, I accepted the shore-based position in Aberdeen. The decision surprised everyone, especially Rebecca, but I needed time to process what had happened. Time to figure out how to present the information I'd been given without sounding like another offshore worker who'd spent too long in deep water breathing compressed air. The transition to shore duty wasn't as difficult as I'd expected. Aberdeen's energy sector headquarters provided enough technical challenges to keep me engaged, consulting on deep water projects across the North Sea and beyond. But the real work happened in the evenings, in my home office, where I carefully analyzed the data that had somehow appeared in my dive log. The information proved startlingly accurate. Ocean temperature measurements, current changes, chemical compositions, all matching predictions I couldn't explain to colleagues who asked about my sources. Slowly, carefully, I began sharing selected information through proper scientific channels, always with plausible explanations for how I'd obtained it. My reputation as a troubleshooter evolved into something more valuable, a consultant who could anticipate problems before they manifested. Companies began calling me to review project sites for potential environmental issues, paying premium rates for assessments that proved uncannily accurate. Rebecca noticed the change immediately. "You're different," she said one evening as we walked along Aberdeen's waterfront, watching supply vessels return from platform rotations. Not bad different, just focused on something bigger than equipment repairs. She was right. I was carrying knowledge that extended far beyond mechanical engineering, information about oceanic systems that most environmental scientists wouldn't discover for decades. The weight of that responsibility was changing how I approached every aspect of my work. "The ocean's more complex than we realized," I said, choosing my words carefully. "Climate change is affecting deep water systems in ways we're only beginning to understand." "Is that why you took the shore position? To work on environmental projects instead of just fixing broken equipment?" "Partly," I admitted. "I think I can do more good from here, working with research institutions and environmental agencies." Dr. Foster contacted me 6 weeks after I'd moved to shore duty. We met at a quiet pub in Aberdeen, away from corporate headquarters and curious colleagues. She arrived carrying a folder that she placed carefully on the table between us. "I've been analyzing the water samples from your last dive site," she said, sliding the folder across to me. "The cellular structures we found don't match anything in known databases." I opened the folder to see microscopic images of organisms unlike anything in terrestrial biology. The structures showed characteristics of both plant and animal cells, with additional organelles that served functions not found in conventional taxonomy. "What do you think they are?" I asked, though I suspected I already knew the answer. "I think they are part of something bigger, something that's been in those waters much longer than we have." She leaned forward, her voice dropping to ensure privacy. "Austin, what really happened down there during that communication blackout?" I considered my options carefully. Andrea was a scientist, trained to evaluate evidence objectively. If anyone could understand what I'd experienced without dismissing it as hallucination or equipment failure, it would be her. "Have you ever considered," I said slowly, "that we might not be the only intelligent life on this planet?" Her eyes sharpened with interest, the reaction of someone whose scientific training had taught her to consider possibilities others might dismiss. "Go on." Over the next 2 hours, I told her everything. The encounter, the communication, the knowledge transfer that had filled my dive log with information I couldn't have obtained through normal means. I showed her the technical data, the environmental projections, the chemical formulas that proved accurate when tested against real-world measurements. She listened without interruption, occasionally taking notes in the precise handwriting of someone accustomed to documenting significant discoveries. When I finished, she sat in silence for several minutes, processing the implications of what I'd described. "This explains some unusual patterns we've been seeing," she said finally. "Acoustic anomalies that don't match known marine life, temperature fluctuations that don't fit our circulation models, current changes that seem to anticipate rather than follow atmospheric patterns. She paused, meeting my eyes directly. If what you're saying is true, we're not just dealing with climate change anymore. We're dealing with a first contact scenario. What do we do with that information? I asked. She smiled grimly, the expression of someone who understood the magnitude of the challenge ahead. Very carefully introduce it to people who might be able to help. The right scientists, the right government contacts, the right environmental advocates, people who can act on it without causing mass panic or triggering military responses. That conversation marked the beginning of a different kind of career. Working through Andrea's network of marine scientists and environmental researchers, I began sharing information that would help humanity understand the true scope of oceanic change. Always presented through proper channels, always with plausible explanations for the data sources, but consistently more accurate than conventional scientific models predicted. The network grew slowly, carefully. Environmental researchers at universities across Europe, oceanographers working on climate change studies, marine biologists investigating species migration patterns. Each contact was vetted through Andrea's professional connections, each piece of information shared with precise timing to avoid raising suspicions about the data sources. Within 6 months, ocean monitoring stations across the North Atlantic began reporting temperature fluctuations that matched the projections in my dive log. Environmental protection measures were implemented based on studies that seemed to anticipate problems before they fully manifested. Shipping lanes were quietly rerouted to avoid critical feeding areas for species most humans had never heard of. The work was frustrating in its necessary subtlety. I possessed knowledge that could revolutionize marine science, but revealing too much too quickly would invite scrutiny I couldn't afford. Government agencies would want to know how a former offshore engineer had obtained data that required sophisticated research equipment and decades of study. Meanwhile, my family life improved dramatically. Being home every evening meant attending Emma's football matches and helping James with his increasingly complex engineering projects. Rebecca and I rediscovered the relationship that offshore deployments had interrupted for years. "You seem happier," she said one Saturday morning as we sat in our garden, watching James test a radio-controlled submarine he'd built for his science fair project. "More settled." "I am," I said, meaning it. "The shore work suits me better than I expected. No regrets about leaving the platforms?" I thought about the crushing depths of the North Sea, about beings who had watched human civilization develop from underwater cities older than recorded history. None at all. James's submarine surfaced in our small garden pond with a satisfied gurgle of its compressed air system. At 15, he was already displaying the kind of engineering intuition that had taken me years to develop. His robotics projects had won several regional competitions, earning him attention from universities with advanced engineering programs. "Dad, watch this," he called out, demonstrating the submarine's underwater camera system. "I can map the entire bottom of the pond from up here." I walked over to examine his work, impressed by the sophistication of his approach. The camera system provided real-time video feeds to a tablet interface he'd programmed himself, complete with depth readings and rudimentary sonar mapping. "That's professional grade work," I told him, and meant it. "Where did you learn the programming for the mapping software?" "YouTube and online forums," he said, with the casual confidence of his generation. "There's a whole community of people building underwater exploration equipment. Some of them are working on really deep water stuff." That caught my attention. "How deep?" "Thousands of meters. They're trying to explore ocean trenches that haven't been mapped yet." He showed me forums where amateur engineers shared designs for pressure-resistant cameras and communication systems. Some of them report really weird findings, sounds that don't match known marine life, structures on the seafloor that look artificial. I studied the forum posts with growing interest. Amateur researchers were encountering the same anomalies professional teams had been reporting, but without the corporate pressure to suppress unusual findings. Their reports were more detailed, more honest about the inexplicable aspects of deep ocean exploration. "What do you think about their findings?" I asked. James shrugged with teenage pragmatism. "Ocean's big, lots of stuff we don't know about yet. Maybe there's more life down there than we realize." That evening I called Casey Rodriguez. He'd taken a shore position with a Houston-based marine engineering firm, consulting on Gulf of Mexico projects. The transition from platform work had been easier for him than expected, partly because his wife Maria had been encouraging the change for years. "How's civilian life treating you?" I asked, after we'd caught up on family news. Better than I thought, he admitted. More time with the boys, better sleep schedule. Maria's happier, which makes everyone happier. He paused. But I keep thinking about that last dive. Those sounds we heard, the equipment failures that made no sense. Any similar reports from your new job? Funny you should ask. We've been getting acoustic anomalies from deep water drilling platforms, especially in the Gulf's deeper sections. Sounds that don't match whale songs or geological activity. The oil companies are keeping it quiet, but the platform crews are talking. I made notes as we talked, adding his reports to the growing database of encounters I was compiling. The pattern was global. Deep water operations across the world's oceans were reporting similar phenomena. Acoustic anomalies, equipment failures at specific depths, visual contacts with unidentified large-scale objects. You ever think about going back? Casey asked. To the deep water? No, I said honestly. I found what I was looking for out there. 2 weeks later, Andrea called with news that changed everything. The European Union was launching a comprehensive deep ocean monitoring program, funded by climate change research grants, but designed to investigate acoustic anomalies and unexplained phenomena in Atlantic waters. They want you as a technical consultant, she said. Your reputation for anticipating equipment problems has reached Brussels. The project director specifically requested your involvement. It was the opportunity I'd been hoping for. Legitimate access to deep water research platforms, government backing for investigations that would have been impossible as a private consultant, and the resources to properly document encounters that most people dismissed as equipment malfunctions. What would my role be? I asked, though I already knew I would accept whatever they offered. Technical oversight for deep water equipment operations, environmental impact assessment, and anomaly investigation, she said. Essentially, they want someone who can recognize when standard procedures aren't adequate for unusual situations. The position would mean occasional travel to research vessels, but based from Aberdeen with regular home time. It was perfect, legitimizing my access to deep water research while maintaining the family stability that had become increasingly important to me. That night, I told Rebecca about the opportunity over dinner. Emma was at a football training camp, and James was absorbed in programming a new sensor array for his underwater robots, giving us rare privacy for serious conversation. It sounds like important work, she said, after I explained the project's environmental focus. And it keeps you in Aberdeen most of the time? Home every night, travel maybe once a month to research platforms, I confirmed. It's exactly what I've been looking for. Challenging work that makes a difference, but without the extended deployments. She smiled, the expression of someone who'd been waiting years for this conversation. Then you should do it. The ocean work clearly matters to you, and this way you can stay involved without disappearing for weeks at a time. 6 months later, I stood on the deck of the research vessel Endeavour, watching our deep water monitoring equipment descend toward coordinates I'd helped select, based on patterns invisible to conventional marine science. The European Union's Deep Ocean Monitoring Project had become one of the most comprehensive acoustic and environmental studies ever attempted. The data we were collecting would revolutionize understanding of deep water ecosystems, though most of my colleagues didn't realize how much of their success was guided by information shared with me in the crushing depths of the North Sea. Temperature monitoring stations were positioned to detect thermal changes months before they affected surface conditions. Acoustic arrays were calibrated to frequencies that would capture communications most humans couldn't imagine. Fascinating readings from the deep sensors, said Dr. Elizabeth Hoffman, the project's marine biology director. A brilliant German scientist who'd spent decades studying North Atlantic ecosystems, she was one of the few researchers who didn't dismiss unusual acoustic signatures as equipment malfunctions. What kind of patterns are you seeing? I asked, though I suspected I already knew. Complex harmonic structures that suggest biological origin, but from organisms much larger than any known species, she said, showing me spectrographic analyses on her tablet. The mathematical relationships are too sophisticated for random whale songs. I studied the data, recognizing patterns that matched the communications I'd experienced firsthand. Any theories about the source? Growing evidence of undiscovered deep water civilizations, she said, matter-of-factly, as if discussing conventional marine life. Intelligence that's evolved independently in oceanic environments. The acoustic complexity suggests language rather than simple animal communication. It was exactly the kind of scientific breakthrough I'd been working toward. Legitimate researchers reaching conclusions that validated what I'd learned through direct contact. Within another year, the evidence would be undeniable to anyone willing to examine it objectively. That evening, I called home from the research vessel. Rebecca answered on the second ring, her voice carrying clearly across the satellite connection. "How's the ocean exploration business?" she asked. "Productive," I said, watching sunset paint the North Sea in shades of gold and amber. "We're documenting things that will change how people think about marine environments." "The kids miss you, but they're proud of the work you're doing." James showed his entire robotics club the project website. "He says you're helping discover new species." "Something like that," I agreed, thinking of beings who had watched human civilization develop from cities older than recorded history. "When will you be home?" 3 days, I said. "And then I'm home for 2 weeks before the next research cruise." "Perfect. Emma's got a championship match next weekend, and James wants to show you his latest submarine design." After we hung up, I remained on deck as darkness settled over the North Sea. The research lights illuminated patches of dark water, where instruments recorded data that would eventually prove the existence of intelligence humans were only beginning to acknowledge. Sometimes, late at night, when the wind carries salt scent inland to Aberdeen, I remember that figure pointing at me in the crushing depths. The choice offered and accepted, the knowledge shared, and the responsibility that came with it. I'm still Austin Palmer, senior offshore engineer, husband, and father. But I'm also something else now, a messenger carrying warnings between worlds, hoping that understanding might yet prevent the catastrophe both our civilizations fear. The oceans are changing faster than anyone realizes. Temperature shifts, chemical alterations, ecosystem collapse, all happening on a timeline that threatens both surface and deep water civilizations. But now, at least, we're not facing it alone. The research continues, carefully documented and scientifically validated. Each month brings new evidence of intelligence in Earth's waters, each discovery making it easier to introduce the truth without panic or military response. Environmental protection measures expand based on data that seems to anticipate problems before they manifest. Rebecca knows some of it now. Not everything, she's not ready for that yet, but enough to understand why I couldn't leave the North Sea completely behind. Why I spend my shore duties consulting on environmental protection projects rather than purely engineering work. The North Sea keeps its secrets, but some of us have been trusted with the most important one of all. We're not alone in these waters, and our survival depends on learning to share them properly.